Beyond the Budget, Examining Poverty with a Capabilities Definition, John On and Michael Dick. Poverty is the state in which someone fails to possess basic capabilities that are integral to living a dignified life because of inadequate economic resources. The best way to measure poverty through this capabilities approach is with the supplemental poverty measure. Imagine if you were an employee of the U.S. Census Bureau with the responsibility to determine whether or not someone was in poverty. This is the Hernandez family. Rob works as a school teacher and Kelly works as a secretary at a legal office. Their children, Sam and Julie, are both enrolled at the nearest daycare center, which is an hour out of the city. Rob suffers from chronic kidney disease and is forced to take off work at months at a time. Would you consider this family to potentially be living in poverty? The identification of poverty is complex in both its definition and application. There are many conflicting notions on the definition of poverty and how it is measured. But first, let's define poverty.
Poverty is a state in which someone fails to possess basic capabilities that are integral to living a dignified life because of inadequate economic resources. Amartya Sen, professor of economics and philosophy at Harvard, describes capability as alternative and different combinations of beings and doings that are within someone's command. This may sound strange, but when we're talking about poverty, we're ultimately concerned with the kind of life we can lead and the freedom we have to lead dignified lives. Poverty is primarily a deprivation of capability. It may come in the form of low income, but the reason we affiliate low income with poverty is because it makes it harder for people to do the things they want to do or be the things they want to be, like being well nourished. The notion of freedom to choose is embedded into the notion of capability, and to promote capabilities is to promote areas of freedom, which is not the same as making people function in a certain way. Functioning is an active realizing and practice of one or more capabilities. For example, when one parent cannot afford to vaccinate their child and another parent refuses to have their child vaccinated because they don't believe in the effectiveness of vaccines, both are exercising the same functioning where health is concerned. But they don't have the same capability because the parent who chooses to not vaccinate their child is able to, but the parent who cannot afford the vaccination has no choice. Now, if you're still associating poverty as exclusively experiencing unsatisfactory income, remember that money is not desired just for money's sake. Any income-based notion of poverty must reflect directly or indirectly to the basic ends which are promoted by income as means, and therefore it is more accurate to characterize poverty as a failure of basic capabilities than a certain level of income. Capability perspective gives us a better understanding of poverty because it forces us to consider not just the lowness of income, but also the reason behind that lowness of income. The relationship between income and capability is affected by factors like age and location. If we focus poverty specifically on incomes, these crucial aspects of deprivation may be entirely lost. Sometimes the same handicaps like disability that reduce one's ability to earn an income can also make it harder to convert income into capability, otherwise known as conversion deprivation. For example, disability and old age, reasons that can lead to low income, makes it harder for people to convert income into good living. For example, additional expenses for medicine and freedom of mobility. Imagine the additional amount of income these families actually need to overcome that disability gap. Yet, poverty in some sense is a matter of income inadequacy rather than a failure of capabilities. And if possible, to identify the minimally adequate income for reaching the minimally acceptable capability levels, it doesn't matter whether poverty is defined in terms of a failure of basic capability or as a failure to have the corresponding minimally adequate income. But before we explore the various ways we can measure poverty, let's understand the way poverty is currently being measured in the United States.
So how does the United States measure poverty? The official poverty measure in the United States, otherwise known as the OPM, was developed in the 1960s and measures poverty by looking at the gross annual pre-tax income and comparing it to a basic threshold. This basic threshold is 3 times the food budget for the family or household, a measure created in the 60s when the family allocated a third of their budget on groceries. The threshold is adjusted yearly based on the fluctuation of the consumer price index and is affected by the makeup of the family or household that is being measured, but it is still rooted in this 3 times the food budget measurement. The OPM is an example of an absolute measure because the threshold remains constant despite changes in the standard of living. The advantage with absolute measures is that it is conceptually easy to understand because there is an absolutist core in the idea of poverty. According to the OPM, a family is considered to be in poverty if their gross income falls below this designated threshold. Designating a family in poverty does not specifically guarantee that they are eligible for welfare programs. They would still have to fulfill other requirements and qualifications. The definition and measurement of poverty do not necessarily reflect what the solution and treatment for poverty is. One of the disadvantages of the OPM is that it leaves out in-kind benefits and near-cash benefits. In-kind benefits include SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or food stamps, Medicaid, housing vouchers, and other supplemental goods that are not monetary benefits but still have an effect on someone's capability. Near-cash benefits include benefits like refundable tax credits, EITC, Earned Income Tax Credit. However, cash assistance such as welfare checks do not get counted in the OPM. Leaving these government programs out inaccurately captures the resources of a family. The OPM is also not adjusted for geographic differences, making mass generalizations of cost of living despite varying housing markets. It is important to account for these differences because someone living in Manhattan does not have the same costs as someone living in rural Indiana. The OPM also does not account for non-discretionary spending, which can include anything from childcare to transportation costs. The OPM was created before the majority of these assistance programs were put in place, and the threshold of 3 times a household's food budget is outdated. Today, a family's food budget might be 6 to 10 times smaller than their total budget. This would mean that people who are above the poverty threshold by the OPM measurement might actually be under their budget by 2 or even 3 times what they need. The OPM does not capture near poverty or depth of poverty. It is very black or white. You are either in poverty or you are not. And if you are in poverty, it does not explicitly say whether you are right below the threshold or way below it. So, it is clear that the OPM does not take all the factors into consideration when measuring poverty, and finding a measurement is a difficult task when you have a capabilities definition of poverty. We believe the Supplemental Poverty Measure, otherwise known as the SPM, is the best solution of measuring poverty through a capabilities approach. In March 2010, the Panel on Poverty and Family Assistance developed the SPM with intentions of reflecting contemporary economic realities and accurately reflecting disposable income. The SPM provides a considerably modernized and more reliable assessment of those affected by poverty by using the 33rd percentile expenditure on food, clothing, shelter, and utilities as its threshold. The SPM is a quasi-relative measure, meaning that it has attributes of both relative and absolute measures. A relative measure defines poverty as a condition of comparative disadvantage, assessed with a changing standard of living. The SPM is adjusted for geographic location and varying costs of living across the United States, an integral update addressing a major defect of the OPM. A second adjustment of the SPM is the adjustment for family size and makeup. The SPM measurement takes into account different makeups of households that the OPM excludes. The SPM includes the whole cohort as opposed to just blood and legal ties. Unlike the OPM, the SPM accounts for the sum of cash income, including in-kind benefits and near-cash benefits, while subtracting taxes, work expenses, and out-of-pocket medical expenses, among other factors. All these reforms in resource measurement provides a more factual representation of a family's income. The SPM is currently the best solution to measure poverty because of the interrelated relationship between capability and economic resources. A better assessment of household resources achieves clarity in identifying and measuring capabilities. However, our definition goes beyond the budget, involving capabilities that are not necessarily controllable or attainable by such monetary means. But because it would be almost unfeasible to capture the capabilities of every household, the SPM provides the closest measurement of someone's capabilities.
Martha Nussbaum, professor of law and ethics at the University of Chicago, proposes capabilities be measured one by one. However, she describes the complications that come with the notion of capability combining internal preparedness with external opportunity. She suggests that we infer capability from certain patterns of functioning, providing the example that if we observe blacks have low voter turnout, even though we can assume that there was an absence of capability, considering people may have chosen not to vote, we could find patterns of low functioning correlating to social subordination and stigma. And we can make an inference that there are barriers that are limiting a certain demographic capability to be represented politically, such as education inequality and difficulty accessing polls. These measurements are often not quantifiable and are so complex that they appear almost immeasurable. However, just because there is not a precise measurement for the capabilities approach does not mean our definition of poverty is false or inaccurate. We must be able to define poverty before we form any notions of potential policy solution or forms of measurement, because we must not falsely measure what is easily measurable, but instead we must ask ourselves the reason we care about these numbers. This is an excerpt from Dorothy Allison, an American writer from South Carolina who did not have the capability to pursue a better quality of life because of the stigma of the ungrateful poor. This was her response when public education gave her this capability and serves as a testament as to why it is so integral to consider poverty through the capabilities approach. They did not see poverty and hopelessness as a foregone conclusion for my life. I could begin to imagine other futures for myself. In order to measure how people's lives are really doing, you must consider the capability definition of poverty. The capability approach focuses on protecting areas of freedom so central that the removal makes a life not worthy of human dignity. And although we must accept that there are capabilities that are immeasurable, the supplemental poverty measure provides a reliable representation of resources that reflect capabilities that are integral to living a dignified life.